The scream of bleeding sheep tore through the Arizona night, and Olivia Turner knew before she even reached for her Winchester that wolves had come down from the mountains. She bolted upright in her narrow cot, heart hammering against her ribs as the panicked cries of her flock crescendoed into something primal and terrified. The small ranch she had inherited from her father 6 months ago sat 3 miles outside Bisbee, perched in the high desert country where the Mule Mountains cast long shadows and predators still remembered when this land belonged to them alone. She was 22 years old, alone except for the sheep that meant the difference between survival and starvation, and now something was killing them in the dark. Olivia grabbed her rifle and rushed to the window, pressing her face against the cool glass. The moon hung full and bright over the desert scrub, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. She could see the flock milling in panicked circles near the wooden fence line, their white bodies ghostly in the moonlight. Then she saw them, low shapes moving with terrible purpose through the sheep, separating the weakest from the herd with the practiced efficiency of born killers. Wolves. At least 5 of them, maybe more. Her hands shook as she tried to load the rifle, her fingers clumsy with fear and the remnants of sleep. She had just managed to chamber a round when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast from the direction of the main road. Olivia squinted into the darkness and made out a rider coming hard, leaning low over his horse's neck. As he drew closer to her property, she saw him raise something in his right hand, something that suddenly blazed to life with orange flame. A torch. The rider let out a yell that carried across the desert air, wild and defiant, and drove his horse straight toward her flock and the wolves circling within it. Olivia ran outside, her nightdress catching on the rough wooden doorframe, her bare feet hitting the cold, packed earth of her yard. She raised the Winchester, but could not get a clear shot, not with the stranger riding directly into the chaos, not with her sheep scattering in every direction. The rider swung down from his horse while it was still moving, landing in a crouch with the torch held high in one hand. In his other hand, she saw the gleam of a blade, long and curved, a skinning knife. He moved toward the nearest wolf with startling speed, and the animal turned to face this new threat, lips peeling back from yellowed fangs. The cowboy thrust the torch at the wolf's face, and the creature yelped and skittered backward, its eyes reflecting the firelight in twin points of green. Another wolf circled behind him, but the stranger seemed to sense it, spinning and slashing with the knife in a wide arc that made the predator think twice about closing the distance. The torch painted wild shadows across the ground, transforming the peaceful sheep pasture into something from a fever dream. Olivia watched, transfixed, as the cowboy moved through her flock like a man who had fought wolves before, who understood their pack mentality and their fear of fire. He jabbed the torch toward a pair of wolves worrying at one of her ewes, and they released the bleeding animal and backed away, snarling. The cowboy kept moving, kept the torch between himself and the pack, used the fire to drive them back step by step. One wolf, braver or more desperate than the others, lunged for his leg. The skinning knife flashed in the moonlight, and the wolf yelped and retreated, leaving drops of dark blood on the pale dirt. The pack began to reconsider, their calculations changing now that their prey had teeth and fire. Olivia finally had a clear shot at a wolf on the periphery and fired. The Winchester's report cracked across the desert, and the wolf she had aimed for bolted. She had not hit it, but the sound was enough. The remaining wolves broke and ran, streaming back toward the rocky hills in a fluid line of gray and shadow. The cowboy stood in the center of her flock, torch still raised, chest heaving with exertion. Her sheep continued their panicked bleating, but they were alive, most of them. The immediate danger had passed. She walked toward him slowly, the rifle lowered but still in her hands, her nightdress swirling around her ankles. As she drew closer, the torchlight illuminated his face for the first time. He was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of whiskey held up to lamplight. His jaw was dark with several days of stubble, and a thin line of blood traced down his left forearm where a wolf's claw had caught him. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, denim and leather worn soft with use, and a wide-brimmed hat that now hung down his back on a stampede string. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough from shouting. His eyes moved over her quickly, checking for injuries, and she became suddenly, acutely aware that she was standing in front of a strange man in nothing but her nightdress, her hair loose and wild around her shoulders. "No," she managed. "No, I am fine. You saved my flock." "I do not know how to thank you." He shook his head, dismissing her gratitude. Any man would have done the same, hearing the commotion. He drove the torch into the ground, burying it deep enough that it would stand upright and continue burning. Then he wiped the skinning knife on his pants and sheathed it at his belt. "Name is Mason Cole. I was riding back from town when I heard your sheep. Wolves have been getting bolder this season. Drought drove the deer further into the high country, so the predators are coming down looking for easier meals." "Olivia Turner," she said. "This is my land, was my father's before he passed last winter." She looked around at her flock, trying to count heads in the darkness. Some had scattered into the brush, but most had returned to huddle together near the fence. She could see at least 2 bodies lying still on the ground, dark shapes that would not rise again. Mason followed her gaze. "Lost a couple, looks like. Could have been much worse if they had had more time." He walked over to examine the dead sheep, kneeling beside them with a practiced eye. "Clean kills, at least. Quick." The pack was organized, well-fed enough to hunt smart rather than desperate. Olivia felt a lump rise in her throat. She could not afford to lose even 2 sheep. The ranch was barely profitable as it was, and she had been counting every dollar, rationing her supplies, trying to make it through until shearing season when she could sell the wool. Her father had built this place from nothing, had spent 30 years turning this harsh desert land into something that could sustain life, and she was determined not to lose it in her first year alone. But determination did not pay bills, and dead sheep meant lost income she could not replace. "I should pay you," she said quietly, "for helping. I do not have much, but I can give you something for your trouble." Mason stood and turned to face her, brushing the dirt from his knees. "I do not want your money, Miss Turner. Like I said, any decent man would have done the same." He paused, studying her face in the flickering torchlight. "But I would accept a cup of coffee if you have some. It is cold out here, and I have got a long ride back to town still ahead of me." She nodded, relief washing through her, coffee she could afford. "Of course. Come inside. Let me find something proper to wear, and I will put the pot on." She turned and walked back toward the small ranch house, very conscious of him following a respectful distance behind her. The house was modest, just 3 rooms and a covered porch, but it was solidly built from adobe and timber, designed to stay cool in the brutal summer heat and hold warmth during the cold desert winters. Olivia lit the kerosene lamp on the kitchen table and quickly disappeared into her bedroom, pulling on a simple day dress and buttoning it with fingers that still trembled slightly with leftover fear. When she returned to the kitchen, Mason had removed his hat and was standing politely by the door, clearly uncomfortable about tracking dirt into her home. She waved him toward the table. "Sit, please. You just fought off a pack of wolves. The least I can do is let you rest for a moment." She busied herself with the coffee, stoking the coals in the stove and setting the battered pot to heat. her father's coffee pot. Everything in this house carried his memory, and sometimes the weight of it threatened to crush her. Mason sat down carefully, as if afraid the chair might break under him. "You are running this place alone?" he asked, and there was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity. "Yes. My father taught me the work before he died. I know it is not common, a woman ranching alone, but I do not have much choice in the matter." She kept her back to him, focusing on measuring out the coffee grounds. "My mother passed when I was 10. There is no one else, just me and the sheep." "That is hard country to work alone," Mason said quietly. "Even for a man. Your father must have taught you well if you have kept it going this long." She turned to face him and found his expression open and honest, without a trace of the condescension she had grown accustomed to in town. Most of the men in Bisbee either pitied her or thought she was foolish for trying to hold onto the ranch. The women were kinder, but even they whispered that she should sell the property and find a husband, settle into a proper life before she wasted her youth on sheep and solitude. "He taught me everything he knew," she said. "How to doctor a sick ewe, how to read the weather, how to shoot straight and keep the books balanced. But he could not teach me how to be in two places at once, and that is what this work requires. I should have been out there tonight, watching the flock, but I fell asleep. I have been running myself ragged trying to keep up with everything." The coffee began to boil, and she poured 2 cups, setting one in front of Mason and cradling the other between her palms. The warmth felt good after the cold shock of the night air. They sat in silence for a moment, drinking the bitter black coffee. Outside, she could still hear her sheep settling down, their bleating gradually subsiding as they realized the danger had passed. "Where do you ride from?" she asked. "I have not seen you in town before, and I thought I knew most of the ranchers around Bisbee." "I just hired on at the Double Cross Ranch about 2 weeks back," Mason said. "Came up from New Mexico looking for work. Mr. Patterson needed hands for the fall gather, so here I am." He took another sip of coffee. "I was in town tonight playing cards at the saloon. Not much else to do on a Saturday when you are new and do not know anybody." "Did you win?" she asked, and was surprised to find herself genuinely curious. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard edges. "Broke even. I am not much of a gambler. My daddy always said poker was a tax on optimism, and he was usually right about such things." Olivia laughed, a small sound that felt strange after the tension of the last hour. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was. Died 5 years back. Apache arrow during a raid down in the territories. He was scouting for the army at the time." Mason's voice remained steady, but she saw the shadow pass across his face. They had that in common then. Dead fathers and the weight of carrying on without them. "I am sorry," she said and meant it. "Life out here is hard," Mason replied, "but it is what we know. What we are built for, I suppose." He finished his coffee and set the cup down carefully. "I should help you check the rest of your flock before I go. Make sure there are no other injuries I missed." They went back outside together, and Mason pulled the torch from the ground to use as a light. They walked through the flock slowly, examining each sheep for signs of injury. Most were unharmed, just frightened. Olivia found one ewe with a deep gash along her flank, and Mason helped her wrestle the struggling animal into the small barn so she could clean and bandage the wound. His hands were steady and sure, holding the sheep still while Olivia worked, murmuring low and calm to keep the animal from panicking. "You are good with them," she observed, wrapping clean cloth around the ewe's middle and tying it tight to hold the bandage in place. "Grew up on a cattle ranch in Texas," Mason said. "Different animals, same principles. You learn to stay calm, they stay calm." He released the ewe, and she trotted off to rejoin the flock, seemingly unaware that she now wore a makeshift bandage. They dragged the 2 dead sheep away from the flock, and Mason offered to help her butcher them in the morning so the meat would not go to waste. Olivia accepted, grateful for the assistance and the company both. It was strange how quickly his presence had shifted from startling to comforting. Perhaps it was simply the relief of not being alone for a few hours, of having someone else to share the burden of the work. By the time they finished checking the entire flock, dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The desert came alive in the early morning light, the red rocks of the Mule Mountains glowing like embers, the sparse vegetation casting long shadows across the pale dirt. Olivia had always loved this time of day, the brief window when the air was cool and everything felt possible before the sun climbed high and turned the world into a furnace. Mason retrieved his horse from where it had wandered to graze on the sparse grass near her fence line. It was a good animal, a rangy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition. He swung up into the saddle with easy grace, settling his hat back on his head. "I will come back this afternoon," he said. "Help you with those sheep, and I can bring some supplies to repair your fence. I noticed a few posts that are rotting out. Wolves find the weak points and push through." "You do not have to do that," Olivia protested, though part of her desperately wanted him to return. "You have already done more than enough." "Double cross does not work Sundays," Mason said. "And I have got nothing better to do than help a neighbor in need. I will be here after noon." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was somehow both courtly and casual, then turned his horse toward the road and rode off at an easy lope. Olivia watched him go until he disappeared from sight, swallowed by the desert landscape. Then she turned back to her ranch, to the work that never ended, and found that she was smiling. Mason returned that afternoon as promised, riding up with a canvas bag of supplies tied behind his saddle. True to his word, he helped her butcher the dead sheep, working with the efficient skill of someone who had processed many animals in his life. They salted the meat to preserve it, hanging strips in her smokehouse to cure. It was hot, bloody work, and by the time they finished, both were speckled with gore and sweat. "You can wash up at the pump," Olivia said, gesturing toward the water pump in the yard. She worked the handle while he scrubbed his hands and forearms, the cold water sluicing away the evidence of their labor. Then they switched places, and he pumped while she cleaned up, the simple domesticity of the act feeling oddly intimate. They spent the rest of the afternoon repairing her fence, replacing rotted posts and tightening wire that had sagged over time. Mason worked with steady determination, and Olivia found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking. He moved with the unconscious confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, his muscles flexing beneath his shirt as he drove posts into the hard ground. She caught herself wondering what his story was, where he had been before New Mexico, what had driven him to keep moving from place to place. "Why do you drift?" she asked as they took a break in the shade of her barn, passing a canteen of water back and forth. "You said you hired on at the Double Cross 2 weeks ago. Were you somewhere else before that?" Mason took a long drink before answering. "I have been moving since my father died. Worked ranches all over Texas, spent some time in Colorado, drifted through New Mexico. Never seemed to find a reason to stay put anywhere." He handed the canteen back to her. "Sometimes I think I am looking for something, but I could not tell you what." "Maybe you are running from something instead," Olivia suggested gently. He looked at her sharply, then his expression softened. "Maybe so. My father and I were close. Losing him felt like losing my compass. I have been wandering ever since, trying to find north again." He paused. "What about you? Ever thought about leaving this place? It would be easier, selling out and starting fresh somewhere else." "Every day," Olivia admitted. Especially on the hard days when nothing goes right and I am so tired I can barely stand. But this land is all I have left of my father. Selling it would feel like betraying his memory, everything he worked for. She took a sip of water, staring out at the desert. And there is something about this place that gets into your blood. The space, the silence, the way the mountains look at sunset. I do not think I could be happy anywhere else, even if it were easier. Mason nodded slowly. I understand that. Land has a way of claiming you if you let it. They worked until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, and when they finally finished, Olivia invited him to stay for supper. She cooked beans and cornbread, simple fare but filling, and they ate at her small kitchen table while the light faded outside. The conversation came easily, ranging from ranching to books to the changes happening in the Arizona territory as more settlers arrived and the wild places grew smaller. "You read?" Mason asked, surprised when she mentioned a novel she had borrowed from the lending library in town. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father," Olivia explained. "She made sure I learned my letters and numbers, insisted education was the one thing nobody could take from me. I have got a few dozen books in the other room. Not much, but I read them over and over." "Would you lend me one?" Mason asked. "Gets lonely in the bunkhouse at night, and I have read the only book I own about 100 times. Olivia felt a warm glow of pleasure at the request. She retrieved a worn copy of Adventure Stories and handed it to him. "Take care of it. That one was my father's favorite." Mason accepted the book with a reverence that told her he understood its value. "I will guard it with my life," he promised, and she believed him. He left as full darkness fell, and Olivia stood on her porch watching his silhouette disappear into the night. She realized with some surprise that she was already looking forward to his next visit, already hoping he would find another excuse to return. The next week fell into a pattern. Mason rode out to her ranch every evening after finishing his work at the Double Cross, arriving as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Sometimes he brought supplies, sometimes just his company. He helped her with the endless chores that came with running a sheep ranch, fixing what was broken, reinforcing what was weak. They talked while they worked, sharing stories from their pasts, discovering the small compatibilities that bound people together. Olivia learned that Mason could play the harmonica and loved thunderstorms, that he had a younger sister married to a banker in San Antonio, but they had not spoken in 2 years over some family disagreement he refused to discuss. That he hated beans but ate them anyway because they were cheap and filling. That he had once wanted to be a schoolteacher, but his father needed him on the ranch, and duty won out over dreams. Mason learned that Olivia could swear like a mule skinner when something went wrong, though she blushed furiously afterward. That she was terrified of scorpions but had no fear of snakes. That she sang while she worked, old ballads her mother had taught her, her voice clear and sweet in the desert air. That she dreamed of one day having enough money to buy more land, expand her flock, build something that would last. On Friday evening, Mason arrived with a troubled expression. Olivia was mending a section of fence near the barn, and she straightened when she saw his face. "What is wrong?" she asked immediately. Mason dismounted and walked over to her, turning his hat in his hands. "I heard something in town today. Thought you should know. There is a man named Gerald Blackstone who has been buying up properties around Bisbee, consolidating land for some big ranching operation. He has been pressuring the smaller holders to sell, and word is he has got his eye on your place next." Olivia felt her stomach drop. She had heard of Blackstone. Everyone had. He was a wealthy man from back east who had come to Arizona with grand plans and deep pockets. He built an empire by squeezing out the small ranchers, offering prices that seemed generous until you realized you had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. "He cannot make me sell," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "No, but he can make life difficult if you refuse," Mason said quietly. "I have seen his type before. They find ways to apply pressure. Cut off access to water, file spurious legal claims, encourage their hands to cause trouble for neighbors who will not cooperate." He met her eyes. "I am not trying to frighten you. I just think you should be prepared." Olivia set down her tools and wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the lingering heat of the day. "This ranch is all I have. I will not sell to him or anyone else." "Then I will help you hold it," Mason said simply, "for as long as you need me." Something shifted between them in that moment, an unspoken acknowledgement that this had become more than a neighborly arrangement. Olivia looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the steadiness in his eyes, the set of his jaw that said he meant every word. She realized with a start that she had come to depend on him, not just for his help with the work, but for his presence, his company, the way he made her feel less alone in the world. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you do that? You barely know me." Mason stepped closer, and she could see the pulse beating at his throat, the way his hands tightened on his hat. "Maybe I want to know you better," he said. "Maybe I am tired of drifting. Maybe I think you are the bravest person I have ever met, trying to hold onto this place against all the odds." He paused. "Maybe I look forward to riding out here every evening more than anything else in my day." Olivia's breath caught. She had not let herself hope that he might feel the same pull she did, the same sense of recognition, as if they were two pieces of the same puzzle finally sliding into place. "I look forward to your visits too," she admitted. "More than I should, probably. More than is sensible for a woman in my position." "What position is that?" Mason asked. "Alone, poor, one bad season away from losing everything." She tried to smile. "Not much of a prospect for anyone." Mason reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I think you are selling yourself short, Olivia Turner. I think you are the kind of woman who faces down wolves in the middle of the night and does not flinch. The kind who works from dawn to dusk and never complains. The kind worth staying put for." She looked down at their joined hands, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "You barely know me," she repeated, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Then let me know you better," Mason said. "Let me court you properly if you would allow it. I know the timing is not ideal with Blackstone circling and your ranch to worry about, but I have spent 5 years wandering, and I think I finally found what I was looking for." Olivia felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden intensity of emotion. She had been alone for so long, carrying every burden by herself, that the offer of partnership felt almost too good to be true. But when she looked at Mason, she saw only honesty in his expression, only hope and something that might become love given time. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, you can court me. I would like that very much." Mason smiled then, a real smile that lit up his entire face, and Olivia felt something inside her chest expand and warm. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture both old-fashioned and sweet that made her blush to her roots. They spent the rest of the evening working side by side, but everything felt different now, charged with new possibility. When Mason left that night, he kissed her cheek in farewell, his lips warm against her skin, and Olivia touched the spot long after he had ridden away, marveling at how quickly her life had changed. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and cautious joy. Mason continued to visit every evening, and on Sundays, they would ride out together to explore the surrounding country, discovering hidden canyons and old Apache campsites, talking about everything and nothing. He was courting her properly, as he had promised, with small gifts and careful compliments, always respectful of her space and her choices. Olivia found herself falling for him slowly and surely, like water wearing away stone, inevitable and right. But Gerald Blackstone's shadow loomed over their growing happiness. True to Mason's warning, the pressure began. First, subtle things. Olivia went to the general store in Bisbee and found that her usual credit had been suspended without explanation. The owner, a nervous little man named Peters, would not meet her eyes as he explained that he could only accept cash going forward. Olivia suspected Blackstone had bought up her debt and called it in. Then her water supply became unreliable. The creek that ran through her property and provided water for her flock began to run dry, even though it should have been flowing strong this time of year. Mason rode upstream and discovered that someone had dammed the creek further up the mountain, diverting the water away from Olivia's land. He and Olivia spent a back-breaking day dismantling the illegal dam, only to have it rebuilt a week later. The harassment escalated. Olivia woke one morning to find a section of her fence torn down and half her flock scattered across the desert. It took her and Mason 2 days to round up all the sheep, and 3 were never found. Then someone shot at her while she was riding the boundary of her property, the bullet whining past her head close enough that she felt the wind of its passage. She reported it to the sheriff, but he was sympathetic and useless in equal measure, explaining that without witnesses or evidence, there was nothing he could do. "Blackstone is behind this," Mason said grimly as they sat on Olivia's porch that evening, watching the sun set in a blaze of crimson. "He is trying to force you into selling." "Then he does not know me very well," Olivia said, her jaw set in a stubborn line. "I am not going anywhere." But the strain was beginning to show. Olivia grew thinner, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. She jumped at sudden noises and had trouble sleeping, always listening for the sound of trouble approaching. Mason started spending nights in her barn, unwilling to leave her alone and unprotected. It was not proper, but neither of them cared much about propriety anymore. Survival came first. 2 months after Mason's warning about Blackstone, the man himself finally made an appearance. Olivia was in her yard hanging laundry when she saw a buggy approaching, pulled by 2 matched black horses that must have cost more than her entire ranch. The buggy stopped in front of her house, and a large man in an expensive suit climbed down, flanked by 2 rough-looking men who were clearly hired muscle. "Miss Turner," the man said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I am Gerald Blackstone. I have been hoping to make your acquaintance." Olivia set down her laundry basket and wiped her hands on her apron, taking the measure of the man before her. He was in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes that assessed her property with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up prey. Everything about him spoke of money and power, from his polished boots to the gold watch chain glinting at his vest. "Mr. Blackstone," she said evenly, "I have heard your name. What brings you out to my ranch business, Miss Turner?" "I am in the process of consolidating the ranching operations in this area, and your property sits right in the middle of the lands I have been acquiring. I am prepared to make you a very generous offer." He named a sum that made Olivia's breath catch, more money than she had ever seen in her life. "My ranch is not for sale," she said firmly. Blackstone's smile did not waver, but his eyes hardened. "I understand your reluctance. This land belonged to your late father, and there is sentimental value attached. But sentiment does not pay bills, Miss Turner." Surely you have noticed how difficult it has become to maintain your operation. The credit cut off, the water problems, the unfortunate incidents with your livestock. Those unfortunate incidents would not have happened without your interference, Olivia said, anger flaring hot in her chest. You have been sabotaging my ranch, trying to force me out. Blackstone spread his hands in a gesture of false innocence. I am sure I do not know what you mean. This is hard country, Miss Turner. Accidents happen. Livestock goes missing. That is simply the nature of ranching life. He paused. It would be a shame if those accidents were to become more frequent, more severe. You are out here all alone, after all. Anything could happen to a woman in your position. The threat was delivered with a pleasant smile, but there was no mistaking it. Olivia felt ice slide down her spine, but she kept her chin up and her voice steady. Get off my land, Mr. Blackstone, and tell your men to stop destroying my property and harassing me. If anything else happens, I will go straight to the territorial marshal, not just the local sheriff. Blackstone's smile faded. The territorial marshal is a busy man, Miss Turner. By the time he could investigate anything, you might not have a ranch left to complain about. He put his hat back on and climbed into his buggy. Think about my offer. It is generous now, but that may change if you continue to be obstinate. Pride is expensive, and I do not think you can afford it much longer. He signaled to his driver, and the buggy rolled away in a cloud of dust. Olivia stood watching until it disappeared, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had never felt so angry or so helpless in her life. Blackstone was right about one thing. She was alone, and he had resources she could never match. How was she supposed to fight a man who could buy and sell her ranch a dozen times over? Mason rode up an hour later and found her sitting on the porch steps, staring at nothing. He took one look at her face and dismounted quickly, sitting beside her. What happened? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Olivia told him about Blackstone's visit, the thinly veiled threats, the impossible offer. Mason listened in silence, his expression growing darker by the moment. He is not going to stop, Mason said when she finished. Men like that do not understand no. They just keep pushing until something breaks. What am I supposed to do? Olivia asked and hated the desperation in her voice. I cannot fight him. I do not have the money or the resources. Mason was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he said slowly, what if you were not alone anymore? What if you had a partner? Someone with a legal claim to the property, someone who could stand with you against Blackstone. Olivia looked at him, not understanding at first. Then his meaning became clear and her heart began to race. Mason, are you suggesting? I am suggesting we get married, he said, turning to face her fully. I know this is not the most romantic proposal, and I know we have not been courting long, but I care about you, Olivia. I think I might be falling in love with you if I am honest. And I cannot stand by and watch Blackstone destroy you. You want to marry me to save my ranch, Olivia said slowly, trying to untangle her emotions. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to accept his offer and damn the complicated reasons behind it. But another part of her resisted, afraid of building a marriage on such shaky foundations. I want to marry you because I think we could be happy together, Mason corrected. The ranch is part of it, yes, but it is not the only part. I have been drifting for 5 years, Olivia, and you are the first person who made me want to stop. I think about you all the time. I worry about you. I look forward to seeing you more than anything else in my life. That is not nothing. But is it enough? Olivia asked quietly. Is it enough to build a marriage on? I think so, Mason said. My parents married for practical reasons. My mother needed security, my father needed someone to help run the ranch, but they grew to love each other deeply over the years. Love does not always strike like lightning. Sometimes it builds slow, like a campfire, steady and warm. He took her hands in his. I am not asking you to love me right now. I am just asking you to give us a chance. Let me stand beside you. Let me help you fight. Olivia looked at their joined hands, at his face so earnest and open, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. He was right. They could build something together, something strong enough to weather whatever storms came. And she realized that she did love him, had been falling in love with him for weeks now, too afraid to name the feeling because it seemed too good to be true. Yes, she said softly. Yes, I will marry you. Mason's face broke into a wide smile, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. Olivia buried her face in his shoulder and felt tears leak from her eyes. Relief and joy and fear all tangled together. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, while the desert wind blew around them and the sun sank toward the horizon. They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Bisbee, with the minister's wife and Mason's foreman from the Double Cross standing as witnesses. Olivia wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk for 20 years, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers Mason had picked that morning. She had never felt more beautiful or more nervous in her life. Mason wore his best clothes, his dark hair slicked back, his hands trembling slightly as he slid a plain gold band onto her finger. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Mason he could kiss his bride, he did so gently, reverently, as if she were something precious that might break. Olivia felt the kiss all the way down to her toes, a promise of things to come. They rode back to the ranch together, Mason's few possessions tied behind his saddle. He had given notice at the Double Cross, burning his bridges to commit fully to his new life. Olivia felt the weight of that sacrifice, the trust it represented. He was betting everything on her, on them, and she was determined not to let him down. That night, they consummated their marriage in the small bedroom that had been Olivia's alone for so long. Mason was patient and tender, taking his time, making sure she was comfortable and willing every step of the way. Olivia had been nervous, her knowledge of marital intimacy limited to vague warnings from older women and her own observations of livestock. But Mason made it good for her, his touches reverent and sure, his whispered words of affection calming her fears. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Olivia's head pillowed on Mason's chest, listening to the steady thump of his heartbeat. She felt different, changed in some fundamental way, as if becoming his wife had unlocked some new version of herself. She was no longer alone. She had a partner now, someone to share the burden and the joy. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Mason asked, his hand stroking lazy circles on her back. "For choosing me, for staying, for fighting beside me." "You do not need to thank me for that," Mason said. "It is where I want to be, where I need to be." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We are going to make this work, Olivia. The ranch, the marriage, all of it. I promise you that." Olivia believed him. Lying there in his arms, safe and warm, she believed they could weather any storm, overcome any obstacle. Together they were stronger than the sum of their parts. Together they could hold the line. But Blackstone was not finished. 2 weeks after their wedding, Olivia and Mason woke to discover that someone had poisoned their main water source, the spring-fed tank where the sheep drank. 8 sheep were dead, and another dozen were sick, their sides heaving with labored breath. Mason and Olivia worked frantically to save the surviving animals, dosing them with remedies and moving them to a different water source, but they lost 5 more before the crisis passed. "This is Blackstone," Mason said, his voice tight with fury as they buried the dead sheep in a mass grave. "He is escalating, trying to bankrupt us by killing our livestock. We should go to the territorial marshal like I threatened, Olivia said. This has gone beyond harassment. This is destruction of property, possibly attempted murder if we had drunk that water. They rode into Bisbee the next day and sent a telegram to the territorial marshal's office in Tucson. The response came 2 days later. The marshal was investigating a series of murders in the southern part of the territory and could not spare the men to look into livestock poisoning. He suggested they work with the local sheriff and gather evidence that would stand up in court. The local sheriff, a heavy-set man named Daniels, listened to their complaint with obvious discomfort. "I believe you folks," he said, "but belief is not evidence. You have got no witnesses, no proof that Blackstone or his men did this. All I have got is your word that the water was poisoned, and even if it was, how do I prove who did it? Blackstone will just deny everything, and without hard evidence, I cannot arrest him." "So we are just supposed to let him destroy us?" Mason demanded. Sheriff Daniels spread his hands helplessly. "Get me evidence. Catch his men in the act, find something that ties him to the crimes. Then I can help you, but my hands are tied without proof." They left the sheriff's office frustrated and angry, no closer to a solution than before. Blackstone had been careful, using hired men to do his dirty work, always maintaining plausible deniability. They could not fight him through legal channels, and they could not afford to hire enough men to guard the ranch around the clock. They were trapped, waiting for the next attack. It came a week later in the form of fire. Olivia woke in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke and bolted upright, her heart pounding. Beside her, Mason was already moving, grabbing his pants and pulling them on. "The barn," he said, and they both ran outside. The barn was engulfed in flames, the dry wood burning like tinder. Their 2 horses were inside, along with the tack and tools they needed to run the ranch. Olivia screamed and ran toward the barn, but Mason grabbed her arm and held her back. "You cannot go in there," he shouted over the roar of the fire. "It is too dangerous. The horses." Olivia cried, struggling against his grip. "Mason, we have to save them." He released her and ran toward the barn door, which was already starting to collapse. He grabbed a horse blanket, dunked it in the water trough, and threw it over his head and shoulders. Then he disappeared into the smoke and flames. Olivia watched in terror, counting the seconds, praying he would emerge. The horses came first, wild-eyed and panicked, their coats singed but alive. Mason had somehow gotten them untied and driven them out. Then Mason himself stumbled from the barn, coughing and gasping, his face black with soot. He collapsed on his hands and knees in the dirt, and Olivia ran to him, helping him away from the burning structure. The barn burned to the ground while they watched, helpless to stop it. Everything inside was lost, all their equipment and supplies reduced to ash and twisted metal. The horses stood trembling nearby, traumatized but alive. That was the only mercy in the entire disaster. "Blackstone," Mason said hoarsely, his throat raw from smoke. "This was Blackstone." "Can you prove it?" Olivia asked bitterly, already knowing the answer. "No, but I know it was him, and I am done playing by the rules." Mason stood up slowly, his jaw set in a hard line. "If the law will not protect us, we will have to protect ourselves." Over the next few days, Mason turned their small ranch into a fortress. He rigged alarms using tin cans and string around the perimeter, set up a watch schedule so one of them was always awake and alert. He taught Olivia to shoot more accurately, spending hours on target practice until she could hit a tin can at 50 yards. They slept in shifts, never both asleep at the same time, always ready for the next attack. The paranoia and exhaustion began to take their toll. Olivia grew thin and haggard, jumping at shadows, her nerves stretched to the breaking point. Mason was no better. his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his gun. The joy and hope of their early marriage faded under the constant pressure, replaced by grim determination and barely suppressed rage. But they also grew closer through the shared adversity. They learned to rely on each other completely, to communicate without words, to function as a single unit rather than two separate people. On the rare quiet moments, they would hold each other and remember why they were fighting, the life they wanted to build together, the future that was worth protecting. One evening, as they sat on their rebuilt porch watching the sun set, Olivia said quietly, "I think I am pregnant." Mason turned to stare at her, shock and wonder warring on his face. "Are you certain?" "Not certain, but I have missed my monthly courses and I have been sick in the mornings." She placed a hand on her still flat belly. "I think we are going to have a baby, Mason." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. She felt him trembling and realized he was crying, silent tears soaking into her hair. When he finally pulled back, his face was transformed with joy. "A baby," he whispered. "Olivia, we are going to be parents." "I know," she said, and felt her own tears start. "I am terrified and thrilled in equal measure. This is the worst possible timing with everything that is happening." "No," Mason said firmly. "This is perfect. This is what we are fighting for, do not you see? Not just the ranch, but our future. Our family. Blackstone cannot take that from us." His words gave Olivia new strength, new purpose. She had not just herself and Mason to protect now. She had their child, a life that had not even begun yet, but already meant everything. She would fight tooth and nail to give that child a safe place to grow, a home to inherit, a legacy worth passing on. The next attack came a week later, and this time they were ready. Mason woke to the sound of their alarm system jingling and immediately grabbed his rifle. Olivia was already awake, her Winchester in hand. They moved to the windows, scanning the darkness for movement. "There," Mason whispered, pointing. "By the sheep pen, 3 men, maybe 4. They watched as the shadowy figures cut through the fence and began herding the sheep toward the open desert. This time, they were not just scattering the flock. They were stealing it outright, planning to make off with Olivia's entire livelihood in one bold stroke. "We take them now," Mason said. "Catch them in the act, force them to testify against Blackstone." They moved quickly and quietly, circling around to come at the thieves from 2 directions. Olivia's heart was hammering so hard she was afraid they would hear it, but she kept her breathing steady, her hands rock solid on her rifle. Mason had taught her well. "That is far enough," Mason called out, his voice ringing across the desert. "Drop your weapons and put your hands up. The sheriff is on his way." It was a bluff. The sheriff was in town, hours away, but the thieves did not know that. They spun around, hands going for their guns, and Mason fired a warning shot over their heads. One of the men dropped his weapon immediately and raised his hands. The other 3 hesitated, clearly calculating their odds. "Do not make me shoot you," Mason said, and there was cold certainty in his voice that said he would have pushed. "I have got you dead to rights for theft. That is prison time. You really want to add a gunfight to the charges." The men exchanged glances, and then one by one they dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Olivia came around from the other side, her rifle trained on the group, and began collecting their guns. Her hands were shaking now that the immediate danger was past, but she kept her voice steady. "Who sent you?" she demanded. "Was it Blackstone?" The thieves maintained sullen silence. Mason walked up to the nearest one and shoved his rifle barrel under the man's chin, forcing his head back. "I asked you a question," he said softly. "And I am not a patient man when someone tries to steal from my wife." "It was Blackstone," the man spat. He hired us to run off your flock, make it look like they scattered in the night, promised us $50 each. But we are just hired hands. We did not know it was personal between you folks." "Now you do," Mason said. He lowered his rifle and looked at Olivia. "Tie them up. I will ride for the sheriff. This time we have got witnesses and proof." It took 2 hours for Mason to fetch Sheriff Daniels, and during that time, Olivia stood guard over the 4 bound men with her rifle across her knees. They tried to bargain with her, offering to testify against Blackstone in exchange for reduced charges, promising they had just been following orders. Olivia listened in stony silence, feeling no pity. These men had tried to destroy her life. They deserved whatever punishment the law handed down. When the sheriff finally arrived with Mason, he took the prisoners into custody and listened to Mason and Olivia's account of the attempted theft. The men, faced with certain prosecution, agreed to testify that Blackstone had hired them not just for this job, but for the fence cutting, the water poisoning, and the barn burning as well. Finally, they had the evidence they needed. Sheriff Daniels arrested Gerald Blackstone the next morning. It caused a sensation in Bisbee. The wealthy rancher protested his innocence, hired expensive lawyers, threatened lawsuits and political repercussions. But the testimony of 4 men was damning, and physical evidence tied Blackstone's men to the earlier crimes. The territorial marshal's office, finally taking notice of the serious nature of the charges, sent a prosecutor to handle the case. The trial took place 2 months later. Olivia and Mason testified about the campaign of harassment and sabotage. The 4 thieves, granted leniency in exchange for cooperation, detailed Blackstone's orders. The case was overwhelming, and the jury took less than 2 hours to return a guilty verdict. Blackstone was sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison and ordered to pay restitution to Olivia and Mason for the damages he had caused. Walking out of the courthouse, Olivia felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The threat that had loomed over them for months was finally gone. They could rebuild, move forward, live without fear. Mason took her hand and squeezed it tight, and when she looked at him, she saw the same relief and joy reflected in his eyes. "It is over," she said, hardly daring to believe it. "It is over," Mason agreed. "We won, Olivia. The ranch is safe. Our future is secure." They returned home to begin the work of rebuilding. With the restitution money from Blackstone, they were able to replace the barn, buy new equipment, and even purchase additional sheep to expand the flock. Mason proved to be a natural rancher, his instincts honed by years of working cattle translating well to sheep. Together, they made the ranch more profitable than it had ever been under Olivia's father. As autumn gave way to winter, Olivia's pregnancy became obvious. Her belly swelled with their child, and Mason treated her like precious glass, constantly fussing over her and insisting she rest more. Olivia found it both annoying and endearing, amused by his sudden overprotectiveness. She felt strong and healthy, more energized than tired, and she refused to spend her pregnancy lounging around while there was work to be done. "I am pregnant, not dying," she told him one afternoon when he tried to take the feed bucket from her hands. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I can still do my chores." "I know," Mason said, "but that is my child you are carrying. My responsibility. Let me take care of you both." His words melted her exasperation, and she let him take the bucket. They had come so far from those early days when he was just a helpful stranger who fought off wolves. Now he was her husband, her partner, the father of her child. She loved him more than she had thought it possible to love another person. "Have I told you today that I love you?" she asked, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. "Not today," Mason said, grinning. "But I love you too, more than anything in this world." Their son was born on a cold February night in 1885, delivered by the same midwife who had helped bring Olivia into the world 23 years earlier. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Olivia was certain she would not survive it. But Mason never left her side, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. And eventually, their baby entered the world with a strong, lusty cry that announced his arrival to the entire ranch. Mason held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, staring at the tiny red face with an expression of awe and terror. "He is so small," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "How is something so small even possible?" "You will grow into him," the midwife said kindly. New fathers always think their babies will break. They are tougher than they look. They named him Thomas, after Olivia's father, and he became the center of their world. Mason proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Thomas when he cried in the night, learning to change diapers and prepare bottles when Olivia was too exhausted. He sang old cowboy ballads to his son in a surprisingly good voice, and he built a beautiful wooden cradle that rocked on curved runners. The years passed in a blur of hard work and quiet happiness. The ranch prospered under their joint management. They bought more land, expanded the flock to 200 head, and built a new house to replace the cramped adobe structure Olivia had grown up in. The new house had 4 bedrooms, a luxury that seemed almost sinful after years of cramped quarters, and a wide front porch where they could sit and watch the desert sunset. They added to their family, a daughter born 2 years after Thomas, then another son 3 years after that. Mason insisted on naming their daughter after Olivia, though she protested that it would be confusing. Little Olivia, they called her Livy to distinguish her from her mother, inherited her father's whiskey-colored eyes and her mother's determination. Their youngest, Samuel, was quiet and thoughtful, more interested in books than ranching. Though he did his share of the work without complaint through it all, Mason and Olivia's love deepened and matured. The desperate passion of their early days together mellowed into something steadier and more enduring, a partnership built on respect and shared experience. They still fought sometimes, sharp disagreements about money or discipline, or how to handle a problem on the ranch. But they always made up before bed, remembering the hard-won nature of their happiness and refusing to let pride or anger threaten it. Mason never did lose his restlessness entirely, his need to keep moving. But now he channeled it into improving the ranch, always starting some new project or experiment. He built irrigation systems to bring water to previously dry pastures. He crossbred their sheep with imported stock to improve the quality of the wool. He learned carpentry and blacksmithing, skills that saved them money and gave him an outlet for his creative energy. Olivia thrived as a wife and mother, though she sometimes missed the simplicity of her life before Mason arrived. Running the ranch had been hard, but it had been straightforward. Now she had to balance the needs of the business with the needs of her family, and sometimes those needs conflicted. She learned to delegate, to accept help when it was offered, to recognize that she could not do everything herself. The town of Bisbee grew around them as the years passed. The mines expanded, bringing more people and more prosperity to the region. The wild, lawless feel of the frontier gradually gave way to civilization, with proper schools and churches, and even a telephone line connecting Bisbee to the outside world. Mason and Olivia watched the changes with mixed feelings, grateful for the progress but nostalgic for the wilder days of their youth. Thomas grew into a strong, capable young man who loved ranching as much as his parents did. He apprenticed under his father, learning everything Mason could teach him about animal husbandry and land management. It was clear that he would take over the ranch when Mason and Olivia were too old to run it, and that brought them both comfort and satisfaction. They had built something that would outlast them, a legacy for their children and grandchildren. Livy proved to be fiercely independent, with her mother's stubbornness and her father's charm. She wanted to be a doctor, an ambition that was nearly unheard of for women in the 1890s, but Mason and Olivia supported her dreams. They sent her to school in Tucson, sacrificing to afford her education, and celebrated when she was accepted into medical school in San Francisco. Samuel, true to his nature, became a teacher. He loved books and learning with a passion that neither of his parents fully understood, though they encouraged it as best they could. He taught at the school in Bisbee, patiently educating the children of miners and ranchers, and seemed content with his quiet life. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Mason and Olivia rode out to the spot where the old sheep pen had stood, the place where wolves had circled her flock, and he had fought them off with a torch and a skinning knife. They sat on their horses side by side, looking out over the land they had built together. "Do you ever regret it?" Olivia asked, "giving up the drifting life to settle down with me?" Mason turned to look at her, his hair now shot through with gray, lines of experience etched around his eyes and mouth. He was still handsome, still the man who had ridden into her life and changed everything. "Not once," he said firmly. "You and the children are the best thing that ever happened to me. This ranch, this life, it is everything I did not know I wanted." He reached over and took her hand. "I was lost before I met you, Olivia. You gave me a home, a purpose, a reason to stay in one place." "You saved me too," Olivia said softly. "I could not have held this place alone. I would have lost everything to Blackstone or exhaustion or just plain bad luck. But you fought beside me. You gave me strength when I had none left." They sat in companionable silence, hands linked, watching the sun sink toward the horizon in a blaze of orange and purple. The desert spread out before them, harsh and beautiful, the land they had claimed and tamed together. In the distance, they could see their sheep grazing peacefully, their children's laughter drifting on the evening breeze as they played near the house. 20 years, Mason mused. It has gone so fast. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I rode up here and saw you standing in your nightdress with a rifle in your hands, looking fierce and terrified at the same time. Olivia laughed. "I was terrified. I had no idea what I was doing, trying to run this place alone. And then you appeared like something out of a storybook, fighting wolves with fire and steel. I thought you were the bravest thing I had ever seen." "I was scared too," Mason admitted. "Wolves are dangerous, but the thought of you facing them alone was worse. I could not ride past and do nothing." "I am glad you did not," Olivia said. She squeezed his hand. "Here is to 20 more years if we are lucky enough to have them." 20 more years, Mason agreed, "and all the years after that until we are too old and gray to climb on our horses anymore." They rode back to the house together as darkness fell, and the lights in the windows welcomed them home. Inside, their children had prepared a special dinner to celebrate the anniversary, and the table was laden with all their favorite foods. They sat together as a family, sharing stories and laughter, and Olivia felt her heart swell with gratitude for the unexpected blessings her life had brought. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. There were droughts that tested their water management systems, harsh winters that claimed sheep despite their best efforts, market crashes that left them scrambling to make ends meet. But they weathered each storm together, drawing on the deep well of love and partnership they had built. Thomas married a girl from town, a sweet-natured woman named Clara who adapted quickly to ranch life. They gave Mason and Olivia their first grandchildren, twin boys who were the spitting image of their father. Watching Mason play with his grandchildren, teaching them to ride and rope, and all the skills he had taught Thomas, Olivia felt the circle of life completing itself in the most satisfying way. Livy finished medical school and returned to Arizona, opening a practice in Tucson. She visited the ranch regularly, bringing stories of her work and the lives she had saved. Mason burst with pride every time he introduced people to his daughter, the doctor, and Olivia loved watching him beam with paternal satisfaction. Samuel married late, wedding a fellow teacher in his 40s. They had no children, but seemed perfectly content with each other's company, building a life centered on books and learning and quiet domesticity. He remained close to his parents, visiting the ranch on weekends and holidays, always bringing new books for his father to read and engaging his mother in long conversations about politics and philosophy. Mason and Olivia grew old together, their bodies wearing out from decades of hard physical labor, but their spirits remaining strong. Mason's hair turned completely white, and his joints ached on cold mornings. Olivia developed arthritis in her hands, making it painful to do the fine detail work she had once excelled at. But they adapted, adjusting their routines to accommodate their aging bodies, letting Thomas take on more of the day-to-day management of the ranch. On a spring evening in 1912, they sat on their porch watching the sunset, as they had done thousands of times before. Mason was 73, Olivia 70. They had been married for 34 years, and in all that time, the love between them had never wavered. "Do you remember the night we met?" Mason asked, his voice softer now but still carrying the same warmth it had always held. "Every detail," Olivia said. "The moon was full. The sheep were screaming, and then you came riding out of the darkness like a guardian angel." "Some angel," Mason said with a laugh, "covered in soot and blood and wielding a knife." "My angel," Olivia corrected. "The one I needed exactly when I needed him." Mason reached over and took her hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "I have loved you from almost the first moment I saw you," he said. "Standing there in the moonlight, brave and stubborn and completely unwilling to give up, I knew right then that you were someone special." "I loved you too," Olivia said, "though it took me longer to admit it to myself. I had been alone so long I was afraid to trust that happiness again." "But you did trust," Mason said. "You took a chance on a drifter with nothing to his name but a horse and a knife. That took courage." "You were worth the risk," Olivia said simply. "You are still worth it every single day." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one, painting patterns across the darkening sky. The desert around them was quiet except for the distant bleating of sheep and the soft sigh of wind through the mesquite. Inside the house, they could hear Thomas and Clara moving about, preparing supper, the sounds of family and home. "We did well, did not we?" Mason said after a long silence. "Built a good life here, raised good children, made the ranch prosper." "We did more than well," Olivia said. "We built something that will outlast us, something our grandchildren and their grandchildren will inherit. That is no small thing." "It started with wolves," Mason mused. "Who would have thought that fighting off a pack of predators would lead to all this?" "Everything important in life starts with a crisis," Olivia said. "A moment where you have to choose fight or flight. You chose to fight for me, for my flock, for a woman you did not even know. That choice changed both our lives." "Best choice I ever made," Mason said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I would do it all again, exactly the same way." "So would I," Olivia said. "Every hardship, every struggle, every moment of fear and doubt, because it brought us here to this moment together. They sat on the porch until the stars filled the sky completely and the temperature dropped enough that they needed to go inside. Mason helped Olivia to her feet, steadying her when her knees protested the movement. They walked into the house arm in arm, moving slowly now but still moving together, still supporting each other as they had for more than 3 decades. Inside, Thomas had set the table for supper, and they sat down to eat with their son and daughter-in-law, talking about the ranch and the family and all the small details that made up a life. After the meal, they retired to their bedroom, the same room they had shared since building the new house all those years ago. Mason helped Olivia out of her dress, his movements practiced and tender. She helped him with his boots, pulling them off with the ease of long familiarity. They climbed into bed together, fitting their bodies into the customary positions they had perfected over years of sleeping side by side. "Good night, my love," Mason whispered, kissing her forehead. "Good night," Olivia replied, snuggling against his chest. "I love you. I love you too." Forever and always. They drifted off to sleep together, their breathing synchronizing in the dark. Outside, the desert night stretched endless and eternal, and somewhere in the distant hills, a wolf howled at the moon. But in the warm security of their bedroom, Mason and Olivia slept peacefully, their lives complete, their love enduring, their legacy secure. The ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's management, and when he eventually passed the responsibility to his own children, they maintained the standards and traditions their grandparents had established. The Cole name became respected throughout Arizona, synonymous with quality sheep ranching and honest dealing. Visitors to the ranch always noticed the portrait hanging in the main house, a painting of a young couple standing together with the desert stretching behind them, the man dark and handsome, the woman bright and determined, both of them looking at each other with unmistakable love. The story of how Mason and Olivia met became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The night the wolves came, and a drifting cowboy fought them off with nothing but a torch and a skinning knife, and found his home in the process. It was a story about courage and love, about choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier, about building something lasting from the ashes of hardship. Mason lived to be 80, passing away peacefully in his sleep with Olivia beside him. She followed him 3 years later, her strong heart finally giving out after a lifetime of hard work and fierce love. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a shared headstone that bore a simple inscription, "Together always." Their children and grandchildren gathered for the funeral, along with half the town of Bisbee and representatives from ranching families throughout southern Arizona. Everyone had a story to share about Mason and Olivia Cole, about their kindness or their wisdom or their unwavering partnership. The minister spoke of love that endured beyond death, of legacies that lived on in the hearts and actions of those left behind. As the mourners dispersed, and the family returned to the ranch house, Thomas stood on the porch where his parents had spent so many evenings together. He looked out over the land they had built, maintained and protected, and felt their presence in every stone and fence post. This was their monument, more lasting than any carved marble could be. This ranch, this family, this love that continued to ripple outward through generations. Inside the house, his grandchildren played on the floor, their laughter filling the rooms with life and energy. His own children discussed ranch business at the kitchen table, making plans for the future while honoring the past. And Thomas knew, with absolute certainty, that his parents' love story would never truly end. It lived on in this place, in these people, in the very land itself. The sun set over the Mule Mountains one more time, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, sheep bleated peacefully in their pens, safe and protected. The ranch that Olivia's father had built and she had nearly lost stood strong and prosperous, anchored by the love between a woman who refused to give up and a cowboy who chose to stay. And if you listened carefully on quiet nights, some said you could still hear the echo of a harmonica playing old ballads, and the soft sound of two people laughing together on the porch, enjoying the simple, profound happiness of a life well lived, and a love that transcended time itself. The wolves never returned to threaten the flock again. But the memory of that midnight battle, the moment when everything changed, remained forever etched in the family history. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a crisis, that heroes come in the form of strangers riding out of the darkness, and that the most enduring bonds are forged in fire and tested by adversity. Mason and Olivia Cole had built more than a ranch. They had built a testament to the power of love, courage, and partnership. Their story became part of the fabric of Arizona history, a bright thread woven through the tapestry of the American West. And as the years turned into decades and the decades into a century, their descendants carried forward the lessons they had taught, the values they had embodied, and the love they had shared so completely. In the end, it was a simple story. A woman alone, struggling to survive. A man adrift, searching for purpose. A pack of wolves that brought them together. And a love that lasted forever, built on the foundation of that first brave act of choosing to fight instead of flee, to help instead of ignore, to stay instead of drift. That was the legacy of Mason and Olivia Cole. Not just a successful ranch or prosperous children, but proof that love can flourish even in the harshest conditions, that partnership can overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the best things in life begin with a crisis and a choice to do the right thing, even when it would be easier to ride on by. The ranch stands still today, run by the fifth generation of Coles, a testament to everything Mason and Olivia built together. And on quiet nights when the moon is full and the desert wind whispers through the mesquite, some swear you can still feel their presence there, watching over the land they loved, the family they created, and the enduring legacy of a love that began with wolves and a cowboy's torch, and lasted beyond death itself into eternity.